Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. And to be a little bit more specific regarding the protests that we've seen and the rights of protesters. We've seen protests all across the country and across the world, really, in recent weeks. In DC alone, there have been over 400 arrests for various offenses. Some for quote unquote rioting, and others seemingly peaceful protests. Now, many of these cases are being dismissed, but some aren't. Kevann, I want to ask you this question. What are you seeing in DC with respect to how police are handling protests in the district? Are there any particular charges that you're seeing? And what type of conduct are police arresting people for?
Right. So I think DC is a little bit unique in that there was a big issue regarding the protests that happened a few years ago when Donald Trump was inaugurated. And there were huge protests, people were arrested. And I think the United States Attorney's Office and the Metropolitan Police Department really did not handle that well. And they got a lot of bad press because of it. A lot of people were arrested. Those cases were later dismissed. So now I think they are taking a bit of a different approach. Early on, within a couple of days after the George Floyd incident, they were a lot more aggressive and they were arresting people a lot more. But as the days began to continue and the protests began to continue, I think they wisened up a little bit and realized that that approach was not working for them, specifically in light of the way public opinion was shifting. Now, when individuals are arrested, they're not really being charged with rioting per se or with looting. Instead, they're being charged with things like a curfew violation or destruction of property, unlawful entry if they're inside, a store or something like that where they allegedly are not supposed to be, or even burglary in the second degree. So those are kind of what they're being charged with now, as opposed to actually rioting. I think the government is being a little more careful and kind of slow playing it as opposed to jumping right into rioting like they did before. And I also think that they're not arresting people at the rate that they were when these first began. I think we all heard about Donald Trump's photo op and how he cleared people out of Lafayette Square and all of that. So I think kind of because they realize that the public opinion has turned against them, they are being a little different than they were before. And I don't think they're arresting people as frequently as they were a little while ago.
Right, right. And a follow-up question to that, Kevann, what's the best way for a protester to avoid kind of being caught up in that dragnet of, you're in a big crowd, a lot of people start running, the police kind of just scoop you up. I mean, what's the best way to avoid being one of those individuals who is identified as a suspect or somebody who's arrested?
Right, and it is unfortunate that that's happening with peaceful protest, and you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and before you know it, there's kind of a police wall on a specific street. They're closing in, and you're caught up, and you might find yourself arrested just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is a little bit tricky because we do want to be out there and protest, but at the same time, you want to protect yourself against being in that type of situation. I think when you do see police, like for example, they had the curfew. If there's a curfew in place, that gives MPD and Metropolitan Police Department the ability to arrest you just for a curfew violation. So pretty much anything you do, they have a reason or an excuse to arrest you and because you are technically doing something illegal if there's a curfew violation. If you're out there, I think you want to first comply with anything that a police officer tells you. You don't want to be confrontational because you're usually not going to win in that situation. You fight the police in court, you fight the police at a later date, but you don't fight the police out on the street because they have the guns, they have the badges, and that's not a battle you're going to win. So I would advise any individual who's out there protesting to do your best to not get in the way of the police. If the police are clearing out certain streets, they tell you to go in a certain direction, you definitely want to comply with that, because if you don't, it's probably you that will suffer in the end.
Definitely, definitely. And to kind of piggyback on that, that answer you gave, Kevann, about fighting in court, Heather, if you could answer the question of, for some people, this is the first time they've ever had any contact with the criminal justice system, first time ever being arrested. And then you have this whole COVID-19 thing going on with the courts. How is that impacting, first of all, what can a person expect if they're arrested? When will they see a judge? What are their rights when they go to court? and what can they expect as far as COVID-19? How does that impact release conditions and et cetera?
Sure. So as of right now, our courthouse is technically still closed. We are virtual for things like our arraignment courtrooms, our preliminary hearing courtrooms, but not really open for business. So that has put a kink into what's sort of been happening with the protesters. Normally, for instance, if you were arrested, you might get to the police station, be able to make a call to someone to have counsel be there to be available for you the next morning in arraignment court. The way it is set up right now, if you are not being held, you actually appear by video from Central Booking, which is a different organization or office that's not in the courthouse. And so you're only seen by the judge on video and normally released. There is a stand-in attorney, some very brave court-appointed attorneys who are on schedule that will assist you, but you will not meet your attorney there. You will receive from the stand-in lawyer that number and that name, and it is up to you to get in contact with that person. Generally, for anyone arrested, I would say to them, make sure you get in touch with your lawyers right away and talk about sort of next steps. It would likely be a status hearing if the case continues. We're not really sure when that's going to happen right now because, again, the courthouse is not open, and many of the people who had statuses beginning in March when we first closed now don't have their status hearings until sometime in September. And so at some point, unfortunately, these new people have to get in line behind those people for when it's setting up. And so that brings a lot of drama to people's lives because they're trying to move on and it's things getting in the way. So it's sort of a very different process. COVID has not helped that. And I think we're going to be dealing with the outcomes of it for a long time.
Definitely. Very insightful information. And kind of related to that, and I want you to address the question of, once you're finally arraigned and you have charges against you, we're starting to see that video footage, whether it's a camera phone or a body camera, is pretty much some of the best evidence that you can have to defend yourself or bring a claim against the police. So I want to talk about recording the police. And this is a question, we can start with you, Hannah, but if anybody wants to jump in here, please do. What are citizens' rights regarding recording police encounters? And relatedly, what are body-worn camera footage requirements for the police? Are they required to have it on all the time? What's the consequence if they don't?
Okay, there we are. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So with regard to recording police officers, you absolutely have a right to record police officers, especially if it's in a public place. And even if it's in your own private dwelling, you can certainly record police officers. There is no crime against recording police officers. With respect to body-worn camera footage, police officers are required, at least in DC, they're required to have the body cams on during their entire shift. And then when they actually get called to a particular scene or they initiate a stop of somebody in their car or on foot, then they actually have to tap their chest and turn the camera on. And then what ends up happening is that the prior 2 minutes before they actually press the button to turn the camera on will get recorded in addition to the actual encounter that the police has. The problem is sometimes police officers don't turn it on in time, and that's usually the most critical time for us as defense attorneys, that we need that portion in time in which the police officer at least first initiates the stop of our clients or the person who ends up getting arrested. And that could usually be the basis for, suppression of evidence or, throwing out evidence that a police officer may have illegally obtained. So they have to keep their body cams on at all times, at least operational, and then turn them on during any police citizen encounter or when they're called to the scene of any type of event.
Nice. And Heather, did you want to add anything about maybe practically, from a citizen standpoint, how to record the police without, finding yourself getting arrested or in trouble?
Yes. So I would say, here's the thing, right? The reality of it is they should be focused on whatever they're doing, right? And so distance is likely a helpful. Not so far that people can't see what's going on, but perhaps in a wider range so that you're getting the entire scenario. One of the things we've heard in the last few days, especially as we've mourned George Floyd and others, are people saying, well, maybe we're not seeing the entire parts of the video. Well, we know that we got the piece in there, but that is something that happens sometimes. People perhaps are focusing their cameras only on the person being arrested and not really paying attention to the officers or other people around. So the more footage that you can kind of capture, because you never know what's going to be important down the road, I think can be helpful as well. And just staying at a distance to maintain your ability to keep recording.
Definitely. Definitely.